Hello, my name is Tony Collins. I'm pastor of the Berkshire United Methodist Church all the way down in Hickson, Tennessee, just outside of Chattanooga. I've met several of you in the past, and I greet you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. I'm here today to share with you the books of Titus and the first 12 chapters of the book of John. These two books are very, very different, but they're both very important. Titus gets overlooked a lot. It's right there after Second Timothy, but it gets overlooked because it seems to say a lot of the same things that First and Second Timothy say. Some people believe that it was written in between when Paul wrote First and Second Timothy. And there's a lot of question about whether or not this was really Paul that was writing this, or if it was somebody claiming to be Paul. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that because we'll probably not be able to prove one way or the other which way it was. So we're just going to accept for right now the story as it's given to us. Titus is seen as the loyal child in the faith of Paul. And we know that Titus and Paul did do a lot of things together. We find their story written throughout other books of the New Testament. Titus first shows up in the journey going to the Jerusalem Council that Paul and Barnabas were making together. That's written about in Galatians 2:1. We also find a mention of him in the Acts version of that story, which would be found in chapters 14 through 16. Titus was a trusted teacher and leader, and Paul sent him to a lot of difficult places. He sent him to Corinth, as mentioned in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, and that time period in which he was sent to Corinth was a particularly difficult time that Paul was having a disagreement with the church in Corinth. He's left him later in Crete as Paul left Crete to go on towards Greece. He left Titus there in order to organize the church. They had spent the winter in Crete and they had organized small groups of leaders, but there needed to be somebody there to help identify who the good leaders were in the church. Later, Paul sends them on to a place called Dalmatia, which is mentioned in 2 Timothy 4, and he's mentioned a couple of other times just as being present with Paul wherever he is. After he was finished traveling with Paul, he returned to Crete to be its bishop. And he stayed there for a very long time until his death. He was very renowned there, and when the Arabs began to take over Crete in the 800s. His skull was taken from his grave and taken to a church called St. Mark's in Europe, and is still there to this day as a relic of the ancient faith. Now, Crete was a place that was filled with difficult people. We use this, and even Paul uses this by quoting one of their philosophers in chapter 1, verse 12. It was one of them, their very own prophet, who said, "Cretans are always liars, vicious brutes, and lazy gluttons." I'm afraid they had this kind of reputation, and it had been around for a long time, so they must have lived into it very well. There's an old myth from Greek mythology that says that they became this way because they because of an encounter with some goddesses. Their names were, I think the first one is Chinus and Thetis and Media. They were arguing about who was the most beautiful, and so they picked a guy from Crete. His name was Idomeneus, and he was not wise enough to say, no, I cannot judge between the great beauty that you all have. Instead, he chose Thetis to be the most beautiful, or judged her to be the most beautiful. Media got very angry. She claimed that all Cretans were liars, and then she cursed them so that all their descendants would never be able to say the truth. It's a very colorful story, but I'm afraid one that even exists to this day. We refer to people who do not behave well sometimes as Cretans. Crete was a place that was very famous in this time. It was about halfway out into the Mediterranean. It was a good place for ships to come and leave cargo and pick up other cargo and take it back to wherever they came from. There were many great places to keep a ship during the winter months when people were afraid of the weather on the sea. So it was a place of a lot of great commerce, and where a lot of different people mixed together. Paul thought it was a great place to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so while he was there one winter, they began to go around and talk to people about Jesus. He wanted Titus to stay so that he could help organize the small groups of people that they had started and help identify leaders that could be good leaders for the years to come in all of those places. He wanted to make sure that people understood that Christians were supposed to be different from the people that they found in Crete. Crete, by the way, was also the birthplace, according to mythology, of Zeus. He was a very corrupt, violent, and terrible person, or god, I guess. And Paul very quickly says that he wants to distinguish between Zeus, the person that they most normally talk about as a god, and the God of Israel, the God of Jesus Christ, who he says never lies. Very different from Zeus, I'm afraid. So Titus is supposed to find good people to lead the churches, and he says that they should be called elders. He also talks about the word bishop, but the difference between elders and bishops is kind of fuzzy here. And they have some of the same qualifications and seem to do some of the same things. Deacons aren't really mentioned here in Crete. They were present back in Israel, but that idea had not gotten this far by this time. An elder was supposed to be blameless. He was not supposed to be arrogant or quick-tempered or addicted to wine or violent or greedy, something that all the Cretans seem to be good at. He should be hospitable, a lover of goodness, prudent, upright, devout, self-controlled. He should have a firm grasp of the word and be a good preacher and a good apologist. An apologist is someone who's a defender of the faith. So you're able to defend the faith from people who are telling things that are not true. In chapter 1, he talks about the opponents that are there. There are some people there that apparently are Judaizers. These are people who believe in God, and who even believe in Jesus, but they also believe that in order to follow Jesus, you have to agree to all the tenets of the Jewish religion. You've already seen in other books that the same group of people were folks that either followed Paul around or were already where Paul came, and they always had difficulty with Paul and with living in the same place with Paul. They wanted all the men to be circumcised. They wanted everybody to follow all the festivals and the dietary laws and all of that. And then if they wanted to follow Jesus, that was fine, but they had to do this first. I'll remind you that the Jerusalem Council that happened in Acts chapter 15 dealt with this, and the elders in Jerusalem sent out letters through Paul and Barnabas and several other people to the churches to say, no, these things aren't necessary. You just have to believe in Jesus and live a good life. In chapter 2, he tells Titus to teach sound doctrine. And again, this is going to sound a little bit like chapter 1, but sound doctrine leads to good living, according to Paul. So older men should be temperate and serious and prudent, and they should be sound in their faith and sound in love and sound in endurance, so that they can teach younger men to be self-controlled and to have integrity and to love their faith and to grow to be very good Christians and very good citizens. Older women are supposed to be reverent, not slanderers, not to be slaves to drink, to teach what is good, so that young women can be taught to love their husbands and their children, and to be chaste, and to be good managers, and to take care of things like they're supposed to as young Christians, so that any opponent will not be able, will be put to shame because they have nothing evil to say about us. Slaves also should be respectful. They shouldn't be mean to their lords, and they should be respectful, even though according to Christianity, they're free. According to their spiritual life, they're free. They are to still live and be good slaves and to take care of each other. Chapter 3 says that we should all be good citizens. For we ourselves were once foolish and disobedient and led astray and slaves to all kinds of things. But when Jesus came, the goodness and loving kindness of Jesus saved us according to his mercy and through the water of rebirth and through the renewal of the Holy Spirit. And that's pretty much the whole book. He gives a final message to Titus. It says, when I sent Artemis or Tychicus to you, he wanted Titus to come and see him at the place where he was. He said, make every effort to send Zemas the lawyer and Apollos on their way and make sure they have whatever they need, and let people learn to devote themselves to good work in order to meet urgent needs so that they may not be unproductive. All who are with me send greetings, he says. Greet those who love us in the faith. Grace be with you all. And that is the book of Titus. It's not very long, only about a page and a half in my Bible, but it has some good things to say. The idea that good, sound doctrine, good, sound faith leads to good actions. It's not the same question that James brings up, where he says if you have faith but you don't have works, then then you don't really have faith. But it is sort of the same question. How can people know that we're Christians? By our faith, by our doctrine, by our actions, by our love. And that is the message of Titus. Now, John is a very different book. John is quite long. It's about 21 chapters long. And it is written by someone named John, though he never calls himself that in the book. He refers to himself as the disciple which Jesus loved, or who Jesus loved. And that seems a little bit highfalutin for us, but that's still how he decides to do it. There's some discussion among people about whether it was John, the son of Zebedee, or whether it was another John called John the Elder. But either way, his purpose, and he states this at the end of the book, not at the beginning, his purpose for writing the book is so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. Now, I'm not going to be able to talk about all the things that happen in the first 12 chapters, but I do want to give you sort of an overall view of some of the things that happen. The first part of chapter 1 is a very, very important part of this book, and it's often called the prologue. It is the creation story, if you will, as told by John. In the beginning was the Word. Here he means that Jesus existed from the beginning because Jesus is the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. These words are going to captivate the human audience for thousands of years, because it speaks about theology. What does it mean that Jesus and God are the same? What is the Holy Spirit? How does that get added in there? And how do we say that we have one God, and yet we talk about three different things? This particular introduction to the book begins to deal with all of those things. Also in chapter 1, we get the story of John the Baptist when John first sees Jesus. And we don't know that they've never seen each other before now, but here we are. And John, who's already developed a pretty good group of followers for himself, sees Jesus one day and says, "That is the Lamb of God. That's the person you should be following." So Andrew, who was one of John the Baptist's disciples, went and got his brother Simon and introduced him to Jesus. And one of the great themes that runs throughout the book is when Andrew and some of the other guys are out there and they're kind of following Jesus around. They don't want to necessarily say anything to him, but they want to see what he's up to. He turns around and says, "What do you want?" And they said, "Well, we wanted to know where you're staying." And he said, "Come and see." And so they did. They came and they sat down with him, and they learned much. And then they wanted to go and share with others. A little later, he had an experience with Philip, who was underneath a tree. And so he found Philip and said, "Follow me." And Philip was from Bethsaida. And Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we found the Messiah. Things are beginning to spread all over the place. And then Nathanael and Jesus have a conversation. And again, he says, come and see. And Nathanael's amazed because Jesus tells him that he heard the encounter that Nathanael and Philip had. And he says, you believe because I told you that I saw you under the tree, but you will see greater things in this. And throughout the entire book, there are things that God is inviting us to see about Jesus. John is inviting us to see things about Jesus. And the difference between John and the other Gospels is that in John, we get events that happen, but maybe more importantly, we get the reason for some of those events. That's why John is often referred to by people as their favorite gospel, because they feel like they're not just getting the story or the actions or just the facts, ma'am, kind of thing, but they're getting an understanding of what the gospel writer is trying to tell them. Chapter 2 begins with the story about Jesus's first miracle. The wedding at Cana in Galilee. I love this story because it's such a great story about Jesus's relationship with his mother, Mary. Now, in this book, we don't get the whole birth story of Jesus, and so we don't necessarily know who she is if we've only read this book. But we begin to see his relationship with her pretty quickly. He gives a sign, and this is referred to as the first sign that he gives to people, that he is the Messiah. And we're going to talk about some of those other signs as we go along. But you know the story. There is a wedding. They went on for days in Jewish time, in Israelite times, and the people began to run out of wine. And so they told Mary, Jesus's mother. She comes to him and says, hey, you need to do something about this. This is a family honor at stake here. And Jesus goes, Mom, I can just hear him saying it that way. And she turns around to the servants that are there and says, do whatever he tells you to do. And then walks away, knowing that he's going to do it because he is a faithful son. Jesus turns the water into wine, and everybody's amazed at the great quality of the wine, and they're amazed that people have saved that to the end. And then it says, this is the first sign that Jesus is the Messiah. The story right after that is really out of place. In all the other Gospels, it's found at the end of the story. But John has put this story right at the beginning. Jesus goes to Jerusalem. He goes to the temple and is for Passover, and he goes in and he clears the temple out. And he says the thing that we've always heard, this is my Father's house, and you've turned it into a den of thieves. I believe that John put it here because this is an example of Jesus's purpose here on earth, is to help clean up, to help cleanse our faith in a way that helps us to understand what God really wanted us to be doing. Chapter 3 is probably the most famous of the Gospels, and it is famous because of one particular verse, and that verse is John 3:16. I want to look at some of the rest of the story here. Nicodemus, who was a Pharisee, came to see Jesus. He came in the middle of the night, not during the day, so that nobody else would see him. He came because he was curious. He wanted to know more about Jesus. And so they had what I believe was probably a wide-ranging conversation about theological concepts and ideas. And in the midst of all that, Jesus says the words that we all know by heart. For God so loved the world that whosoever believeth in me, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, so that whoever believes in him may not perish, but have eternal life. I really like to add to that verse 17. Indeed, God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. I think sometimes in our desire to be as Christian as possible or as faithful as possible, we forget that first God loved us and then called us to love him and to love each other. Jesus is here to give us a new way of looking at the world and looking at how we are to live in the world. Right after that, there's a little episode between Jesus and John the Baptist and their disciples. John says during that time, he's the one that you need to follow, and I'm going to decrease and he's going to increase. Chapter 4 is a great story about Jesus and the woman of Samaria. You know this story. The woman came out in the middle of the day because she had not lived a very wholesome life. And therefore, people gossiped about her all the time, and they thought she was unclean. And so they treated her like she was unclean. And she met Jesus there, and she, of course, knew that he was a Jew because of the way he was dressed. And she was amazed to find out that he would talk to her, and he asked her for some water. A real strict Jew would not have talked to her at all, and he certainly would not have received anything from her hand. So she was amazed by this, and they also began a conversation. And he asked her some questions, and she began to answer them. And then he said something about her husband, and she said, I don't have a husband. He said, yes, but you've had several husbands, and the person you're living with right now isn't even a husband. But I can give you water that is not like this water. I can give you water that will bring you everlasting life. And what a great story that is for her. She wants to know where this living water comes from. And he invites her to go and tell people in town. Now, this was a big deal for her because people in town didn't listen to her. They didn't associate with her. She was not a person. But she goes in and says, this man has told me everything I've ever done. And maybe he's the Messiah. And so folks began to come out and they began to listen. And Jesus stayed there for 2 days. Again, no self-respecting Jew would have probably even gone that way unless it was an emergency. But he certainly wouldn't have stayed there for very long. But he stayed there for a couple of days, and all the people began to believe because of her testimony. And I think that's a great way in which Jesus lifted her up and made her part of the community again. Right after that, he returns to Galilee. And when he came to Galilee, the Galileans loved him. They welcomed him since they had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem at the festival because they were there as well. Then Jesus heals an official's son. This guy was from Capernaum, and it says he was part of the royal household. So he's not probably Jewish, but he's been helpful to the people by supporting the synagogue. And he comes to Jesus while he's in Galilee and says, "My son is dying. Can you please help?" I think this was a desperate move on the father's part because he did not really believe that Jesus would do it, but he had to ask him just to make sure. And Jesus did not go with him to Capernaum, but he said, "Go home, your son will be well." And on his way home, he met his servants who were coming to tell him that his son was well, and he got well about the same time that Jesus said that he was well. Chapter 5 leads us into a big controversy. And this story happens in, it was during the festival of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he went into a place called Bethsaida, which was a place that had several big porches, and then there was a pool there. And every now and then the Holy Spirit would stir up the pool, and whoever got into the pool first would be healed. So people had stayed there for years and years trying to get into the water so that they could be healed, because they were people who had no hope any other way. The passage in verse 5 says that there was a man there who had been ill for 38 years. That's incredible. He had been there hanging around this pool for 38 years. And Jesus comes and asks him a question. "Do you want to be made well?" And the sick man answers him, "Sir, I don't have anybody to help me. And before I can get over there, other people jump in the water and they get healed, but I don't." And Jesus says, "I want you to stand up, take your mat, and walk." And at once the man felt stronger, and he stood up and he took his mat and he began to walk. Now Jesus disappears at this time. And when he disappears, then the Pharisees who were there came over and they jumped on the guy who's just been healed and says, "Why are you carrying that mat around? This is the Sabbath day. Not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath day." And carrying and picking up are both forms of work that were outlawed on the Sabbath. But this guy says, "Well, the guy who made me well told me that I should pick it up and go away because I don't need to be here. I've been here 38 years. And in all that time, the Pharisees had done nothing to help him. But he sees Jesus later in the temple, and Jesus tells him, "Do not sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you." Then by that time, he can ask somebody and finds out that it's Jesus. And he tells the Pharisees that it was Jesus. And this begins a big controversy about the authority of who Jesus is. The Pharisees approach him and said, "You healed somebody on the Sabbath." And Jesus answers them, "My Father is still working, and I also am working." So now they're angry with him, not only because he violated the Sabbath laws, but he's claiming to be the Son of God. There's a long conversation then for the rest of the chapter about whether or not he can be the Son of God and how that is possible and what that means. And the Pharisees are getting angrier and angrier. Chapter 6 gives us another sign about who Jesus is. In chapter 6, he heals the 5,000. And in in the story, you know how it is. There are all these people gathering around. Now, in Matthew and Luke, the disciples come to Jesus and ask, how are we going to feed these people? We need to send them home. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. In John's account, it's Jesus that asks the question, but he says that Jesus asked the question in order to test them and see how they would do. Then Simon Peter says, there's a little boy here with a couple of fish and 5 loaves of bread, but that's no good. And Jesus said, bring me that. And he tells them to make everybody sit down, and then he feeds them. Everybody was amazed. Everybody was so amazed that they were ready to proclaim him king and march him right down to Jerusalem and toss out the Romans and toss out King Herod and his family. And so he disappears. This is one of those times when he just suddenly is not there anymore. He's withdrawn to the hills and is there praying for some period of time. The disciples leave to head back towards the other side of the lake. And then in the middle of this time, they're rowing across the lake, and suddenly they see Jesus and they're very scared. He says, do not be afraid. And this story is a little bit different from what we've heard before, where Simon Peter says, let me come out and walk on the water with you, and it doesn't go very well. In John's account, they asked to get out and walk on the water with him, and instead he comes and gets in the boat, and it says immediately they were at the other side of the lake, which is interesting. It was a great way for him to be able to head to the other side. Chapter 6, though, also deals with who Jesus is, and he says there, I am the bread of life. Then he talks for a long time about the bread that comes down from heaven, and he who eats it will live forever. And there's a long discussion. You know, people say, well, you know, when our people before were in the wilderness, Moses gave them the manna, and Jesus corrects them and says, well, it wasn't really Moses that did that. It was God that did that. And he did that for a purpose, but I'm here and I am the bread of life. And if you eat me, and he says later, eat my flesh, then you will live forever. Well, that disturbed everybody, of course. And we know that Jesus was talking about how he was going to die on the cross, and he is going to start sharing that part of the story with everybody soon, but they don't really understand what he's trying to say here. So some of them say, this is really difficult, and some of them began to leave during this time. I think some of them just wanted some more bread for today, like he did yesterday, but people tended to fall away. And even the disciples, they weren't sure that they understood what was going on. And he turns to them and says, do you wish to go away? And Simon Peter said, Lord, to whom can we go? And Jesus said, you are my disciples, and I have picked you. And then he says a little side remark, but one of you is the devil. Of course, he's talking about Judas, and we don't have any record that Jesus actually said that anywhere else. So we think maybe that was an editorial comment, because every time John talks about Judas, he puts in a sort of a snide remark. Yeah, he's the one that's going to betray Jesus. And In chapter 7, we get a lot of controversy about who Jesus is. We've just had this time where people have started sort of melting away from following him so much. And then his brothers show up. And he's in Galilee, and he did not wish to go about in Judea anymore because the Jews were looking to do away with him down there. And it was during the festival of booths. So his brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea so that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one who wants to be widely known acts in secret." But he says, "No, I'm not going to do that right now." And what he does is he doesn't go down to the festival of booths, which lasts for 7 days, but he goes down in secret, and he doesn't reveal who he is until about halfway through the week. And then he comes out and starts teaching in front of everybody. And everybody starts, the Pharisees again start asking questions about him. And they actually send out guards that are supposed to arrest Jesus, but they want to do it kind of quietly. They don't want to do it in front of everybody because a lot of people were beginning to believe again. And the guards actually come back, and the Pharisees say, "Why didn't you arrest him?" And they said, "Because never has anyone spoken like this before." I love that part of the story. Chapter 8 tells about the woman who was caught in adultery. Again, this is going to be an action of Jesus, and then we're going to talk about what it means after that. And the story is, the woman was caught in adultery. She's brought before Jesus. She's thrown down on the ground, and they say, "What are you supposed to do? And what do you want us to do with her?" And according to the law, she should have been killed, stoned to death. Jesus, kneels down beside her, and he writes something in the sand, and everybody always wants to know, what did Jesus write? Some people say he wrote down a list of sins of all the people that were there. Some people say that he wrote down some sort of scripture that they would recognize. But he says, "Let the one who has not sinned throw the first stone." Well, of course, in this story, he's the one who's without sin, and he refuses to throw the first stone. Eventually, everybody drops their rocks and they leave. And the woman looks up and says, and he says, "Has no one condemned you?" And she says, "No." And he says, "Then go, sin no more. Have a different life. You don't have to do this anymore." And I know I'm adding some words there, but that's what he meant. Go and live your life a different way than what you've done before. And then in verse 12, he says to his disciples, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And again, I think what he's doing here, if you go back to the beginning, he talks about bringing the light of life into the world, and so that it could conquer the darkness that's in the world, the darkness that's in our heart, the darkness that's in our action. Right after that, Jesus foretells his death. This is the first time that he's done that. And then he talks about his true disciples. And he says, "Very truly, I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you're descendants of Abraham, yet you look for an opportunity to kill me because there is no place for in you for my word. I declare that I have seen in the Father's presence As for you, you should do what you have heard from the Father. And then there's a big discussion about the fact that they are children of Abraham. And there's a long discussion here about who he is and where he's from and how he can claim to be the Son of God. Chapter 9 is probably my favorite story in the first part of John. It's a story about a man who'd been born blind. If you were born blind, it was a sign that your parents or your grandparents, or maybe you, had done something wrong and you were being punished by God. So there's a story where people ask, who's at fault here? Whose sin is it? Jesus comes up to the guy who was born blind and he heals him. And he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And then he went and washed and came back able to see. And the neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, isn't this the same guy that used to sit and beg all the time? And he comes up and says, yep, that's me. I'm the man. The Pharisees hear this has happened and they want to investigate and see what's happening here again. So they go to the man that was born blind and they start asking him, who is it that did this? He must be evil. And the guy says, well, how can he be evil? He healed me of my blindness. He was able to do that. And, it was believed that only someone who was filled with God's Spirit could do something like that. So then they go and find the man's parents and they say, surely he wasn't blind from birth. And they say, oh, yes, he was. And so I love the man because he says, I don't know who this guy is. I don't know anything about him, but he helped me see. And therefore, this is talking on several levels, not just about physical blindness, but about spiritual blindness. And in verse 35, Jesus heard that they had driven the blind man out. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? And he answered, and who is he, sir? Tell me so that I may believe in him. And Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and the one who is speaking with you is he. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped Jesus. And Jesus said, I came into the world for judgment so that those who do not see may see, and those who do see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees nearby heard him say this, and they said, surely we are not blind, are we? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say we see, your sin remains. Chapter 10 is a continuing teaching where Jesus talks about the sheep, meaning the people of Israel, and the people of the world, and talking about shepherds. And he says two things about himself. At one time, he says, I am the gate for the sheep, because the sheep go into a fold at night, and the shepherd often slept across the opening to the fold to make sure that nobody could get out and no wolves or anything else could get in to harm the sheep. But then he goes on a step further and he says, I am the good shepherd in verse 11. And I'd like to read just a little bit of that. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand, who is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves, and the sheep leaves the sheep and runs away. And the wolf snatches them and scatters them. The hired hand runs away because the hired hand does not care for the sheep. But I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me. Just as the Father knows me, I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. He goes on to talk about that and his relationship with God and his relationship with the people. The Jews were angry by this time, and they pick up stones again to stone him. And he says, I've shown you many good works from the Father. For which of these are you going to stone me? And the Jews answer, it is not for a good work that we're going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, though you are only a human being, are making yourself God. And anyway, Jesus escapes from them miraculously again, and he went away across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing earlier, and he remained there for a good little while. Chapter 11 tells the story about his friend Lazarus. Lazarus had two sisters. It was Mary and Martha, and you've heard about Mary and Martha before. Mary was the one who was wanting to hear what Jesus had to say and would sit at his feet and listen for hours on him, while Martha was always trying to fix everything and take care of everybody. So Lazarus dies. He gets sick for a while, and Jesus knows that he's sick, but he doesn't leave until Lazarus has died. He stands up and says, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to awaken him. And then they head out. And Jesus tells them later, plainly, Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. When he arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been dead for 4 days, which means that there was no chance that he was alive. And Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, and Mary stayed at home. This is a really important story because Martha says, Lord, if you'd been here, I know that Lazarus would have made it. And I think this is to show that Mary had done the right thing. She had listened to Jesus more than Martha had, and therefore Mary had a better understanding of who Jesus was. Jesus says to Martha, your brother will rise again. And she says, oh, I know he'll rise in the resurrection at the end of time. And then Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? And that's when she says, yes, Lord, I believe he will rise when the Son of God, the one coming into the world, comes. This is a basic question that we need to ask each other. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives will believe in me and believes in me will never die. Do you believe that? Jesus is asking now for a commitment. Mary comes out because Martha's gone back in and says, Jesus wants to talk to you. And she comes out, and their conversation is a little bit different. When she comes out, they go to the tomb, and he weeps because he sees her weeping, and he asks where they've laid him, and she says, Lord, come and see. Again, there's the come and see theme that runs through. Um, then Jesus, sorry, the conversation he has with Mary goes a little bit differently. He says to her that that Lazarus will be raised, and she believes right away that this is true, and she believes that it can happen even now when there seems to be no hope. And then Jesus, again, greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. And it was a cave, and there was a stone there. And he says, "Take away the stone." And they said, "No, we can't do that because he's been dead a long time. It'll really smell bad." And he calls Lazarus out, and Lazarus comes, and they set him free. Now there's a serious plot to kill Jesus, because he's not only claimed to be the Son of God, he's done something that nobody else can do. He has raised the dead. And so the Pharisees get together and they start talking about how they're going to kill him. Interestingly enough, they also have a plot in the next chapter, you'll see it, to kill Lazarus again. We can't have this guy walking around being proof that Jesus was who he said he was. We're going to have to kill him again, and this time we hope he stays in the ground. Chapter 12 has Mary coming to Bethany, where they're having a meal with Lazarus and Mary and Martha, and Mary brings some expensive perfume, and she's the one who anoints Jesus's feet. Judas, who gets another snide remark from John, who says he kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought this so that she might keep it for the day of my burial, and you'll always have the poor, but you do not always have me." Then we have Jesus's final triumphal entry into Jerusalem. It is a little bit different from what you read in the other Gospels. He comes in, and all the hosannas and stuff like that are the same. But there's some Greeks who wish to see Jesus, and Jesus kind of pushes them off and says, "Just wait, they're going to have their chance, but for right now." And then he gives another prediction about his death. This prediction doesn't go over very well with some people. Some people are beginning to say, "Yeah, I don't really like that part." And so they begin to wander away. In verse 44, there's a great summary of Jesus's teaching, and I encourage you to read that. Verse 44 through the end of the chapter 12. This is where I'm going to stop. We're stopping at a great place, because next we're going to go to the Passover supper. Jesus is going to wash the disciples' feet. There's going to be a long discussion about what all of the Passover meal means, and what the crucifixion means, and then even what the resurrection means. And then we'll get to the stories after the resurrection. Thank you for letting me talk to you about John and about Titus. The Word of God is very important for all of us, so that we can understand how we're supposed to live as God's disciples.